everyone. So today we will discuss about tuberculosis, mainly the guidelines uh, of MDR-TB and how to treat and how to diagnose. So TB is the top infectious disease killer worldwide. As per the Global TB Report 2019, in 2019, 10 million people fell ill and more than 1.5 million people died from TB. In India, total TB incidence around 26.9 lakhs cases. And as per the RNTCP guidelines, in 2018, RNTCP detected and initiated treatment of 46,569 patients of MDR-TB and 2,724 patients of XDR-TB. Uh, So there is no specific symptomatic criteria that we can diagnose TB clinically or radiographically. So these are some symptomatological symptoms that we can suspect TB. Patient with a low-grade fever with a night sweat with a evening rise temperature, it can be TB. Cough with hemoptysis for more than 2 weeks. PUO in 20% case, it can be tuberculosis, malaise, fatigue, weight loss, it can be tuberculosis, anemia of chronic disease, usually normocytic normochromic. In some miliary cases, it can be hypochromic microcytic. In pancytopenia and hyponatremia, it can be tuberculosis. So now, how to diagnose the tuberculosis if in a resistance patient and drug susceptibility? So first we have to do the sputum smear direct microscopy. For that we are using a FB staining oil in oil emergent microscopy. It, uh, it has a low sensitivity less than 50%. If we have to increase the sensibility, we have to take the BAL specimen with bronchoscopy. It can be increased up to 70%, 60 to 70%. And for that, we have to we need a minimum 10,000 organisms per ml of sputum. And LED
Deep,
fluorescent
let me stop
microscopy.
you over here. Deep, let me
Yes, sir.
stop you. What are the ways that you can collect samples? What are the ways that you can increase the yield of the organisms in the sample?
Early, yeah, basically we got two samples. First, spot sample, and then other one is early morning sample for better diagnosis.
How will you instruct the patient? What will you instruct to get the correct? Because he may give you saliva, no?
Yes, sir. So for that we
Because your diagnosis is based on AFB staining. So your sample which is submitted has to be correct. Otherwise, you will go on a false track.
around 4 to 5 ml we need for the examination.
No. What Dr.
Perfect.
Lawat is trying to get at is how will you increase the yield of a sample to show you that there could be your chances of positivity go up.
What Dr. Modi can actually tell maybe. How do you collect the sample for tuberculosis? What precautions the treating doctor should tell the patient when to increase the yield?
Yeah, so basically there are certain do's and don'ts when you collect the sample. You ask the patient to, preferably even for the spot sample, to rinse his mouth before giving the sample, because sometimes if the patient has just eaten something, then and there are some food particles, they can definitely, may decrease the yield of getting a good result. For the early morning sample, ask the patient to get up in the morning, to rinse his mouth, and then whatever comes, ask him to take a deep breath from, and then give a forceful cough with an open mouth. So when he is doing it, preferably he should be sitting in a ventilated room, very well cross-ventilated room, and should not be infecting to the others. If the patient nebulize the patient, so nebulization, mostly it should be with hypertonic saline, that is your 3% of normal saline. So patients can take nebulization for 10 minutes with 3% normal saline, and then it can help them to bring out the sputum. So I think these are two more important things. The patient has to take a deep breath in and then open his mouth and then forcefully
Piyush, you want to add anything?
So that's fine. I mean, induced sputum is the important thing, as told, because many times the patient may not be producing enough amount of sputum, and the sample they submit is mainly saliva. So, short of bronchoscopy, probably, like sir explained, the induced sputum is something which can help in improving the yield.
So I think
Is
all
there any?
residents should note this, and when they are telling a patient to give a sample, you have to tell the patient accordingly. Like Dr. Modi highlighted very nicely how the specimen is to be collected. A small note here I would like to make also. Actually, when you are discussing diagnosis of tuberculosis, no, at least at a personal level, for pulmonary tuberculosis, of course, what I find useful is to put it into three categories: tests for active tuberculosis, tests for latent tuberculosis, and tests related to the treatment of tuberculosis, so culture and so many other things. Do you feel this is a good classification, Dr. Mahavir? Because then you classify the test properly and you know what you're doing the test for.
Definitely. I agree with this approach.
Is there a role of pooled sample versus spot sample? I mean, what is your take on that? Overnight pool sample versus spot sample. Piyush or Mahavir?
So I couldn't get it.
I said, would you like to take a pool sample of, let's say, 12 hours, or would you like to just take a spot sample for increasing the yield? Mahavir, you're not audible.
Just a minute. My audio is on. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes. So basically, spot sample is for people, those who are not able to come on the subsequent 2 days. So in case if your patient is able to bring the early morning sputum for consecutive 2 days, nothing like it. So it is basically for patients in RNTCB program where the patient may be lost for follow-up. So that's the reason that they have asked for the spot sample. So if your patient is able to get 2 consecutive early morning sputum samples, so what you're saying is overnight 12 hours and then early morning sample, nothing like it. So always it is preferred to have early morning sample as compared to because there will be more pool of bacilli, and plus especially the cavities, and plus whatever the bronchiectasis if the patient has, then early morning the patient will be able to bring out that sputum sample. So it's better to have a early morning sample.
And generally we write into 3 days. No, always residents will always write sputum AFB into 3 days.
Yeah, now it is converted to 2 days for the, because it was shown in the RNTCP program that 2 days sensitivity versus 3 days sensitivity. It doesn't make that much of difference when you're considering a large population. So now it is converted to 2 days of sample.
And then among those 2, they say that at least one has to be early morning, preferably, out of the 2.
Yes.
And other
Yes.
instruction which we need to give to the patient is when they get the sample, it should not be exposed to the sunlight.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can proceed.
A better technique is LED fluorescent microscope. In that, no need for dye improvement, increase the level of light also. These are the RNTCP grading for AFB sputum screening. If there is no AFB in 100 fields, then we put negative. If 1 to 9 in 100 fields, then it's scanty. 10 to 99. Hello?
Yes.
I think for all residents, it is worth learning from Dr. R.S. Wadia that at his age, he is so enthusiastically attending all these seminars. So something to learn for all of us.
Then 10 to 99 per 100 fields is grade 1, and 1 to 10 in per field that is grade 2, and more than 10 per field is grade 3. There is an automated culture that is WHO recognized. In that 100 organisms per ml of sputum required for the growth, and 10 to 12 days it takes for the grow organism, and that also detect the drug susceptibility. There are two types: radiometric Bactec 460, and other is non-radiometric MG 960. So there is two methods for the drug susceptibility uh, uh, with PCR, Gene Expert, and the other is the line probe assay. For Gene Expert, we are mainly using the CBNet technique. And it takes 1 hour 45 minutes around, and initial diagnostic test for the children and adults with HIV also, and allow rapid screening of rifampicin resistant used in extrapulmonary TB also. 70% sensitivity in AFB negative and 98% sensitivity in positive. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Detect only MTB complex bacilli only. Here is the sensitivity and specificity of the samples. Sputum sensitivity is 88% in CBNet, and specificity is 99%. For lymph node, 84.9% sensitive, and specificity 92.5%. For CSF, 79.5%, and specificity 98.6%. For pleural fluid, 43.7%. So we can use a pleural fluid CBNet for pleural fluid. So we have to take biopsy for that. And specificity again is 98.1%. For gastric lavage, sensitivity is 83.8% and specificity is 88.8%. Other technique is line probe assay. It is also PCR-based techniques and done only in the sputum AFP positive cases. And it takes 68 to 72 hours. It detects the INH and rifampicin resistant as well as resistant to propranolol and second line injectable drugs. Lipoarabinol mainland is also detected in urine line probe assay.
You can be heard.
So whenever we suspect the
There is a lot of background noise. We can't hear. Just deep 1 minute. There's a lot of background noise. Can everybody mute themselves, please, so we can hear the speaker? Please unmute when you want to speak, but otherwise keep your speaker muted so we can hear the speaker. Okay, Deep, continue.
So whenever we suspect tuberculosis, we have to take a sputum smear and see into the oil emergent microscopy for AFB. If a smear is negative, then we have to do CBNet for the further evaluation. If it is positive, we ask for Bactec and MG for the drug susceptibility. And if the smear is positive in oil emergent microscopy, then line probe assay for the INH and rifampicin resistance.
Okay, I will like to interrupt. Can I say something?
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mahavir. Go ahead.
Yeah. See, basically, this was previously when this line probe assay, there are two types of line probe assays. So initial days we had type 1 line probe assays where it used to be positive only when your sputum smear AFB is positive. But now we have this second line probe assays, which are like available even in Ruby and in most of the centers. This line probe assays which are available, which are advanced version, or we call them as level 2 line probe assays. So where we don't need to be the patient has sputum AFB positivity. Even in sputum AFB negative cases, also the line probe assays show very good sensitivity and specificity. So in fact, because Gene Expert is picked up, that is because it's been available at free of cost at most of the government centers. That is the reason that Gene Experts are used extensively. If you see cost-wise also, line probe assays are actually at the equal cost as the Gene Expert. Okay, so line probe assays, and they give more information. They give you information about the INH as well as rifampicin resistance, that is for your Heinz test level 1. And if you have Heinz test second line, then you can have resistance to fluoroquinolones and aminoglycosides. Now there are some specific genes what we see in patient when we are doing a Heinz test. So in Heinz test or in the line probe assay, you not only detect the INH and rifampicin resistance. For example, for rifampicin, there is a RPO beta gene which is calculated, which is for which the resistance is tested. For INH, the INH resistance is by two different genes. One is the INHA and the other is the CAT gene. So when you are reading the report of Heinz test, suppose you have a patient where INHA mutation is detected. So this patient, you can still give them high dose of INH, so which is like 15 to 20 milligram per kg, and this resistance can be converted to a susceptibility pattern. If you have a patient who has CATG mutation, then even the high dose INH is not going to work and you cannot get it. So it is not only INH and rifampicin, it will give you information about the INH, about the high dose INH. Suppose a person where you cannot use INH at all, these patients will be resistant to the ethionamide also. So you are getting one more drug resistance pattern, that is ethionamide also. So by doing a Heinz test, you can do INH, rifampicin, low dose and high dose INH, and so 4 drugs actually you can test by doing a Heinz test for first line. And it is not only for AB positive cases. Okay, it was initially when the line probe assay were not very well developed. So that's the time we used to have these guidelines that do it only for AB positive cases. So now even if the smear is negative, you can still submit the sample for line probe assays. So just to clarify this doubt.
In latent tuberculosis infection, 1/3 population of the world is positive for the tuberculosis. In among that, 95% are latent tuberculosis infection. So we have to detect with tuberculin test or IGRA test. So for tuberculin test, we are used the purified protein derivatives for tuberculin or RT23, 0.1 ml for 5 international unit given intradermally. After 72 hours, we have to see the induration depth.
Could you have it louder?
Sir?
Could you have it a little louder? Speak a little louder.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. If induration depth is more than 15 mm, is significant in the low risk and normal patients. If in 5 to 15 mm, significantly in the laboratory person and the IV drug abuser, and in patient with the HIV post-transplant, recent contact with tuberculosis patient and patient which are on steroids or anti-TNF or fibrotic lesions consist with the old TB. In this patient, we get more than 5 mm induration is significant. So for that patient, we have managed with the INH prophylaxis for 9 to 6 months. And then IGRA test, interferon gamma release assay is more specific, but in children, tuberculin skin test is preferred. So basically, IGRA test is based on the interferon gamma release in response to the recirculating T cells. In that, we are looking for the antibodies ESAT6 and CFP10. So now the tuberculosis management.
I will just stop you for a minute. Yes, I will ask Piyush as well as I will ask Mahavir that currently how significant do we really look at the TT in absence of any symptoms of any kind? That suppose you do get a 15 millimeter patient completely asymptomatic, what would be your approach to such a patient?
Actually, given the currently available tests like the genotypic as well as the phenotypic test, GeneXpert, LPA, and the cultures, I think the tuberculin skin test or IGRA, either of them should not be used for confirming or ruling out the diagnosis of tuberculosis. I mean, they can be useful in certain specific patient populations, as in HIV patients or rheumatological diseases who are going to be on anti-TNF therapies or high-dose steroids. In those patients, they can be used to diagnose latent TB at most, where decision regarding treatment of latent tuberculosis is taken. But in an otherwise TB endemic country like India, these two tests should never be used for confirming or ruling out the diagnosis.
But at times you do get patients with just PO and you don't know what is going on. and all your tests are negative, and you do a T10 and TT comes, more than 15 meter, would that be a sufficient indication that you should start empiric AKT in these patients?
Well, in extreme situations, it may happen. But then with the things like say PET scan, the contrast CT scans available, and with better modalities to obtain samples. I mean, even for deep intra-abdominal lymph nodes or nodes in the chest, there are now better modalities to obtain samples from there to have a tissue or a microbiological diagnosis. So therefore, currently it is highly not recommended to rely on only this indirect evidence. It can be at most said that it is supportive. It is not at all confirmatory.
Yes, I
As much
agree.
as possible, we should always chase the microbiological or pathological diagnosis by obtaining the necessary samples.
So is it for extrapulmonary TB also?
Even for extraordinary
yes.
TB also, I will say that if you have a person with asymptomatic tuberculosis, always first try to exclude that there is active infection. As Dr. Piyush rightly said, we have to get help of CT chest, maybe a PET CT scan, sonography of the abdomen, and see for the neck nodes, because many times we all tend to just jump into the investigations and we miss looking for the neck nodes and for the axillary nodes. So make it a routine practice that whenever you get a patient of this tuberculin test positive, you have to see for the neck nodes and for the axillary nodes. Ask for the positive family history. Sometimes you will be able to get some positive family history in some of these patients. TB gold also, as Dr. Piyush rightly said, that unless the patient is immunocompromised, you are suspecting tuberculosis clinically and you don't have any other evidence to prove that. So these are some cases where you can take help of IGRA. Otherwise, IGRA also is not very helpful. In extrapulmonary TB, most of the times the patient will have some symptoms. There will be some symptoms. TB in our country is not like absolutely without symptoms. And try to get sample as and when possible, even for abdominal node, even for the port spine or from the abscess from a node. So everywhere you should be able to get somewhere or the other, you should be able to hit the lesion, and then we want more diagnosis microbiologically in more of these cases because we see a lot of MDR TB. So giving empirical anticox is one, but if you are giving empirical anticox and even if the patient has TB, but if it is MDR TB, you are still missing the diagnosis. So that's the reason that always try to get a microbiological diagnosis in these patients.
So actually we had a patient in ICU. He came with actually prostatic abscess. So cultures were sent and we did tuberculin test and everything for Cox. Everything came negative. Blood culture grew Staph aureus, and later on he was managed with antibiotics. 4 weeks later, he presented to us with port spine. So that's why I asked this question, whether in extrapulmonary TB also its relevance is there or not.
See, cases are there. I mean, I'm not saying that a prostatic abscess with tuberculosis, I mean, it is quite rare. We all don't see that commonly. And port spine also won't happen all of a sudden. That when it may be since the time the patient had this prostatic abscess, there might be some other infection, co-infection along with this. If patient CT or PET CT would have been done, it might have picked up some infection at that point of time. Okay, it may be that this prostatic abscess and the port spine, they are also not related, because you had grown Staph aureus in the blood culture. So that is a good indication that it is not tuberculosis. Not tuberculosis there.
Yeah, and other thing is that prostate and thyroid are, although there are case reports of prostatic or thyroid TB being reported, they are considered as sanctuary sites for tuberculosis.
Exactly.
And many a times you will see that patients who are admitted for some other critical illness, because there are immunity related changes in the patient, they may have reactivation at some entirely unrelated extrapulmonary site. So that could,
Yes.
could probably have happened in this patient.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Please keep asking questions. Deep, carry on.
Yes. So now tuberculosis management. So there are all old concepts that category 1, category 2, MDR, XDR concept are now outdated. Now we have only two main types of drug susceptible cases and drug resistant. In drug resistant, main two types: resistant to INH only and resistance to rifampicin plus INH, plus or minus INH. So there are two new drugs These two nutraceuticals we are using for the drug-resistant TB in recent years, bedaquiline and delamenic. Bedaquiline is a mycobacterial ATP synthesis inhibitor. Dose is 400 milligram per day for 2 weeks. Then continue to 200 milligram 3 times per week for 22 weeks. Bedaquiline has extended half-life. Uh, uh, for 18 or more than 18-year-old patient we are using, and for 8 to 17-year-old patient may be considered only after the DCGI approval. And delamenic is a mycolic acid synthesis inhibitor. Half-life is 36 hours. We use for more than 6-year-old patient. For 3 to 6-year-old patient may be considered only after the DCGI approval.
What is mycolic acid?
There are 4 wall around the bacilli. Mycolic acid is one of the layer which cover the bacilli. Basically, it is a cell wall around the antigen.
Sure. Okay, go ahead.
And these are the WHO recognized 3 groups for the longer MDR TB regimen. In group 1, levofloxacin or moxifloxacin, bedaquiline, and linezolid. All 3 drugs we should use in a longer MDR TB regimen. And group 2 is clofazimine and cycloserine and terizidone. That 1 or 2 medicine we should use. And group C is for complete the regimen and to modify the regimen. So in drug susceptible patient, 2 month HRJD and 4 month HRE, and for drug susceptible patient, a patient is H mono or poly DRTB. Then we have to give levofloxacin and rifampicin, ethambutol, and pyrazinamide for 6 months. And MDR or rifampicin resistant TB, there are shorter MDR TB regimen and all oral longer MDR TB regimen. For shorter MDR TB regimen, for 4 to 6 months, we have to give moxifloxacin, kanamycin or amikacin injectable, and then ethionamide and clofazimine and pyrazinamide and high dose of INH or ethambutol. And for 5 months, moxifloxacin, clofazimine, and pyrazinamide and ethambutol. And for the oral longer MDR regimen, for 6 months, we have to give bedaquiline, and then continue for 18 to 20 months, levofloxacin, linezolid, clofazimine, and cycloserine. These are the groups according to the weight of the patient and doses of the medicine as per RNTCP guidelines.
Can you name the bactericidal drugs? Which are the bactericidal drugs?
No, sir.
Then which are the drugs which are bactericidal? So suppose you take SHRZE, linezolid, clofazimine, and all those.
Yes,
So I think Piyush, can you
so in
spell out
in
on
other
this?
words, Dr. Deep, which are the most important drugs in first line and which are the most important in second line?
Second line.
So if you say first line, then INH and rifampicin are the most important drugs out of the 4. And when it comes to second line, the injectable agents and the quinolones are most important, followed by linezolid and cycloserine. These have more side effect compared to others. Most others are relatively static. And other thing about the drug resistant TB regimen, I mean, are you going to discuss any other regimens after this?
no, sir.
Yeah, because this longer and shorter regimens or regimen involving bedaquiline or delamanid, now these are mainly for pulmonary tuberculosis. That is one. And second, this is possible mainly in programmatic management of TB because these drugs are not available commercially for use in private sector. So essentially, when you are managing TB in private sector, you may not have access to some of these drugs. So in such cases, how would you formulate a regimen for a rifampicin resistant or a multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, whether pulmonary or extrapulmonary?
Piyush and Mahavir, are these terms given up? The MDR, XDR, and everything?
No, the term is still there.
Because he said they are given up now.
No, that is not given up.
No, I don't think they are
No,
given up.
only that
See, as per
category
the
A, B,
latest
C, and all this.
classification, yes, category A, B, C, that you have to have all three drugs from category A, then one of the drugs from category B, and if the category A, all three drugs are not available, then two drugs from category A, two drugs from category B, and likewise you can have drugs from category C as well. The term MDR and XDR, they have said that it is not to be used. That is for the only for the regimens to for the RNTCP, because this whole management is basically taken over by RNTCP. Bedaquiline is not available anywhere in the private sector. It's available only with the government, and there are a lot of hassles when when the patient wants to be enrolled on this particular drug. At present, it is available only with the Own Chest Hospital, where the patient has to go. They have to stay there for a day or two, and then the drug becomes available. So it is recently been made available. Delamanid is not available anywhere at present, so it will be soon available. So bedaquiline is available only on special request, and from Germany, these people, Johnson and Johnson, is supporting this drug to Indian government. Second thing is, when you are saying about the short course MDR regimen, so whenever you have a patient whose gene expert shows rifampicin resistance, first thing you have to do is you have to send the sputum sample for TB culture, because even if gene expert is gold standard nowadays, the culture has not replaced the gene expert. Okay, so whenever possible, first send the sample for your TB culture, and many times what happens is that you have to modify the regimen based upon your culture report and followed by sensitivity. Okay. And when you are saying once you have a patient who has gene expert rifampicin resistance, you have diagnosed this patient as rifampicin resistance or MDR tuberculosis, you have to subject the patient either for a short course or for a long course of the individual regimen. So how do you decide whether this patient is suitable for a shorter course MDR regimen is, as Dr. Piyush said, that this patient should not be having extrapulmonary tuberculosis. So short regimen is only for pulmonary TB. It is for patients where they have never taken second line drugs for more than 1 month in their lifetime. Okay, that is the second thing. And you have to know that the patient doesn't have resistance to fluoroquinolone or any of the other drugs, like you said, clofazamine and then kanamycin and then etronamide. So these other drugs the patient is not resistant to. So once you have this information, then only you can subject this patient for a shorter regimen of MDR. If not, then you have to convert this patient to a longer course of MDR. So this is the basic difference, that whenever you have a patient with rifampicin resistance, first you ask yourself and to the patient that if he has taken any treatment before, you have to submit the sample for TB culture. There is no extra fluoroquinolone resistance. There is no extra pulmonary tuberculosis. Patient is non-pregnant. Then you can consider the patient for shorter regimen. Otherwise, you take the patient sample for sputum for TB culture and subject him for the longer regimen for MDR-TB. So that is how I think the first management in these patients.
And
Are you
therefore,
having
now,
slides on the side effects, or you are not?
I think Piyush wants to add something. Piyush, go ahead.
yeah, so that's why, as per what Dr. Modi has said, what is important is we should not restrict ourselves to only one out of the 3 or 4 tests available. Ideal situation, we should ideally send a ZN stain, gene expert, line probe assay, as well as culture.
Yeah.
If there is sample related constraint, like which is typically there in things like CNS, TB,
Yes,
pot spine,
yes.
or lymph node related thing, then we probably have to prioritize. But then sending only ZN stain or only gene expert is not sufficient. We should ideally send all 4. There is a lot more information to be obtained from line probes and MJIT culture also. And for the usual regimens to be formulated, the usual MDR or rifampicin resistant. Actually, the WHO has divided the drugs into group A involving the quinolones, group B with the second line injectables, group C with the core second line drugs like ethionamide, cycloserine, linezolid, and clofazimine, and then group D has three again subgroups. D1 has pyrazinamide, ethambutol, and high dose isoniazid. D2 has bedaquiline, delaminate, and D3 has the drugs with partial effect against TB, like PAS, imipenem, cilastatin, or amoxicillin. So in this, ideally from group A towards D, we should keep on selecting one drug from each group, like A and B, and then as many from C as possible, with depending upon sensitivity in the culture. And if that does not give a robust regimen, then only we should go to group D1, D2, and D3, again in the same sequence.
Okay, I think you can go ahead.
Yes. Now HIV with
Yeah,
TB.
one thing I interrupted again in between also. Are you having a slide on side effects?
No, sir. Sorry.
Then if you don't have a slide, tell me 2 or 3 side effects of S, H, R, E, and Z.
Is that H?
Streptomycin, what are the side effects you know?
For peripheral neuropathy and vestibular toxicity also. Hearing loss can be.
INH.
INH.
Is peripheral neuropathy very common with streptomycin?
No, sir.
No. Anyway, with INH, what are the side effects you expect?
Hepatitis
What
is
will
common,
you look
sir.
for? Yeah.
Hepatitis is most common, and there are peripheral neuropathy can be. And the seizure is also side effect.
Rifampicin.
Rifampicin, hepatitis is toxic. And
so, suppose a patient is on SHRZ or HREZ, which is a drug which you will ask the history and you will know that the patient is taking the medicine or not taking. Suppose the patient is taking medicine he says I'm taking medicine every day, and 2 weeks down the line there is absolutely no change. Can you just on one question find out whether the patient is taking the drugs or not?
High colored urine.
Which drug colors the urine?
Rifampicin.
Yeah.
In color.
Yes. Very good. Yeah. So you can ask very easily whether what the color of his urine every day and whether it's every day the same color.
yes.
Okay. And pyrazinamide, what's the toxicity?
Pyrazinamide, hepatitis, and arthralgia also can.
Which drug increases uric acid?
Hyperuricemia.
Okay. You can go ahead, I think. Any questions from Dr. Mahavir or Piyush?
Yes, so this AKT-induced hepatitis is very important here, and sir is also here. So, Dr. Deep, which of the first line drugs, suppose the patient is on HRZE, which of them is most likely to be hepatotoxic? Like if there is hepatotoxicity, which one would you stop first, or while reintroducing, which one would you reintroduce first?
Pyrazinamide we have to stop first.
True. Correct.
Parimal, you want to just talk a little bit about drug-induced hepatitis?
I think we'll do it at the end because already we are, I think, 40 minutes.
Okay. All right.
We'll do it at the end.
Sure.
HIV and TB. Most common opportunity infection in HIV patients occurs at the CD4 count of 300. Relative risk of reactivation of TB in HIV patient is 100%. Drug-resistant TB and extrapulmonary tuberculosis are common in HIV patient. Reason for TB in HIV patients are decreased Th1 response and decrease in interferon gamma. So if the latent TB, TST is more than 5 mm or IGRA is positive, treat with INS for 9 months in HIV patients. If TST is positive with HIV, has 10% risk every year for development of active TB, and the regimen are same as per the guidelines, and only the drug susceptible patient, 2 HRCD plus 7 HR is helpful. When to start ART? If a CD4 count is less than 200, then ART with within 2 weeks of the starting of ATD. And if CD4 count is more than 200, then ART within 8 weeks of the starting of ATD. And cotrimoxazole prophylaxis to all HIV and TB patients to prevent the pneumocytic pneumonia. Uh, Now, reconstructive inflammatory syndrome, IRIS. IRIS is basically paradoxical worsening of the clinical symptom in the HIV patient with TB, seen in 10 to 20% cases with the initiation of ART at the low CD4 counts. Risk factors are the low baseline CD4 counts, low baseline viral load, a shorter interval between the ATT and ART, greater reduction in the viral load after starting ART. Treatment is steroid. Prednisolone 1 to 2 milligram per kg for 1 to 2 weeks, then gradually decreasing dose.
Yeah, Dr. Deep, can you get a similar thing in non-HIV patients?
Very unlikely, sir.
No, so in fact, in extrapulmonary tuberculosis, mainly lymph node and CNS TB and port spine, in these three situations, paradoxical response is very common because TB also has an immunomodulatory effect on the body. So many times you typically get a patient who is drug susceptible as per gene expert or MGIT culture, who has initially improved only to worsen after few weeks into the treatment. And then we are stuck whether it is drug resistant or it is paradoxical response. So there it is important to ask the patient's history. If there is initial improvement and then worsening versus somebody who has never improved. So that is the first clue which will be towards paradoxical response versus MDR. So that is very much possible even in non-HIV patients and especially in extrapulmonary because lymph nodes many times we'll see that on AKT the abscess ruptures and then the purulent discharge starts. So that is typically because of paradoxical response. And can you go back to the previous slide, the HIV and TB one? So about the latent TB and HIV, in India there is a divided consensus amongst the various HIV practitioners because many of our HIV patients can present with tuberculosis. So even if IGRA or TST is positive, please make sure to find active focus of TB. So bare minimum chest X-ray sonography has to be done. In fact, it won't be wrong even to get a CT scan with contrast because there, in India, chances of having active TB at the time of HIV diagnosis are far more than having latent TB. Secondly, about this CD4 less than 200, the time when we start ART entirely depends on where is the TB. If it is something critical organ like CNS TB, then it is better to delay up to almost 4 weeks after starting AKT.
TB in pregnancy. Really, it is not a contraindication for the treatment of drug-resistant TB. Safety of new drugs like bedaquiline and delamine are not yet established. Two second-line injectable are contraindicated throughout the pregnancy because it affects on the 8th cranial nerve of the fetus. So ethionamide is the contraindicated in first trimester due to the teratogenic effect. Management of the drug-resistant tuberculosis in a pregnant woman. If the duration is less than 20 weeks, then advice for the MTP. If patient are willing to MTP and then start the regimen, and if more than 20 weeks or patient is not willing for the MTP, if a patient is isoniazid mono or poly drug-resistant TB, then start the regimen. And if the MDR TB, modified longer regimen is suitable for that. TB in patient with the renal impairment. Great care should be taken in the administration of the second line drug in patient with the renal impairment. Other drugs which may require a dose or interval adjustment in the presence of mild to moderate renal impairment are the ethionamide, fluoroquinolones, and cycloserine and PAS. In a drug-resistant TB patient, blood urea and serum creatinine should be monitored prior to treatment initiation, then monthly for 3 months, and then every 3 months. These are the drug dose adjustment according to the creatine clearance and if patient is on hemodialysis. TB in patient with the pre-existing liver disease, rifampicin, INH, and pyrazinamide and PAS and ethionamides and bedaquiline are the hepatotoxic drugs. The potential for the hepatotoxicity increase in the elderly, alcoholic, and malnourished, and in patient with the pre-existing liver disease. Second line drugs are suitable used in the presence of mild hepatic impairment, as they are relatively less hepatotoxic than the first line drugs. Shorter MDR TB regimen will be avoided due to presence of these drugs.
So, Dr. Modi, he's not discussed about the duration of anti-tubercular treatment, like for instance, pulmonary tuberculosis, CNS tuberculosis, lymph node tuberculosis. I think Piyush, you can take up, I think, because he's probably signed out.
So as per the latest, latest RNTCP guidelines for pulmonary TB and almost all forms of extrapulmonary except CNS, bone and joint and spine TB, the duration for drug susceptible TB treatment is 6 months. I mean, the latest RNTCP guidelines do not recommend the regimen to be increased to 9 months or 12 months in extrapulmonary TB involving lymph node, pleural effusion, abdominal TB, or any other places. Mainly for CNS TB, it should be 9 to 12 months, and spine TB, it should be 9 to 12 months when it is drug susceptible.
And about management of hepatotoxicity, which are the tests which you do and how do you go about it? This is for the person who presented, actually.
Dr. Deep.
Yes, sir.
Deep, you want to answer that?
Yes, sir.
If we before this, one question I like to ask Piyush to answer probably, so that it will be a teaching for. Now, suppose there is a case of pulmonary tuberculosis. He is susceptible to all drugs. You have started the medications. First, we can ask the person who presented, how do you go about monitoring this patient? What all do you look for? And so you have to look for compliance. You have to look for side effects. You have to look for effects. So all these things, how do you monitor these patients?
Yes, sir.
Right upper lobe tuberculosis, drug susceptible, started on anti-tubercular treatment. So compliance, like I said, you can check on basis of the color of the urine. At least you can get some idea. Then how do you monitor these patients? Do you do sputum or you do chest X-ray? You check them clinically, or what do you do?
Sir, according to RNTCP guidelines, there is a different category-wise follow-up schedule are there. If the patient is on oral mono or poly drug-resistant TB, monthly patient should follow up.
No, just one patient is started on HRZE. So what things would you ask? That's what sir is asking.
HRZE, and he's susceptible. He is susceptible.
Inexpert and culture.
So how do you monitor?
So basically, when you start them on the first line regimen, there are some instructions that you will give in the beginning. One is, of course, this urine color. Some people may get scared that it is blood or something in the urine, so that you have to tell. Second thing, we need to tell them about some common side effects related to first line drugs. Like if they get any itching or rashes after starting first line drugs, or if they develop persistent vomiting, if they get yellowish discoloration of eyes, all these things we have to tell the patient that if these things are there, report to us immediately. Usually it is common to have some degree of gastritis and nausea in first week, but if it continues beyond that, then we should check their liver function test. Otherwise, liver function test after 4 weeks of starting AKT, first line AKT should be good enough. Now, again about hepatitis, if the transaminases increase more than 5 times the upper limit of normal, irrespective of symptoms, we have to consider it as a drug-induced hepatitis and do the necessary changes in the regimen. If the transaminases are only more than
3 to
3 times
5
upper
times.
limit of yeah, about 3 times with
3 to
symptoms.
5.
Yeah, above 3 times with symptom and above 5 times irrespective of symptoms, the hepatotoxic drugs have to be one. And while reintroducing, it will be rifampicin, INH, and then if there
Pyrazinamide
is
is not
no
to be used.
pyrazinamide is omitted and replaced by a quinolone.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and similarly, although it is extremely rare, we should always give instruction to the patient to report any visual changes. I mean, that is one of the rarer toxicities, mainly with ethambutol, but you may find 1 or 2 cases in a year or two. So the first symptom that patient can have is color blindness actually, because it causes optic neuritis and affects the color zone more. So first they'll have pain, rashes and itching, and visual disturbances. So patient has to
And
report to us
rifampicin
immediately.
hepatotoxicity can sometimes lead to a little bit of a cholestatic picture, unlike the INH hepatotoxicity. And what about X-ray improvements? X-ray improvements after starting in a susceptible individual for drugs cavitatory.
Yeah, so clinical, then radiological. Then the first things to start improving would be there will be improvement in fever. Then followed by that there will be improvement in the appetite, and then over a few weeks patient will start getting weight. Whereas X-ray will take almost 4 to 6 weeks to start showing any degree of improvement radiologically. So that's why previously also in RNDCP it used to be that there is no radio improvement at 4 weeks, then you do checkup for MDR, which is now removed because upfront itself we are supposed to check for MDR.
Normally, when we treat tuberculosis, we treat in the outpatient with daily drugs. And DOTS is a definitely viable option, which somehow was not discussed in this. So there you don't give the drugs daily and still they act. So something about DOTS, maybe you can educate.
Actually, it's after 2016-17, the new update of RNDCP, which is they have done away with alternate day regimens for all categories. Till 2016, there was a daily regimen only for CNS tuberculosis, HIV with TB, and pediatric patients with tuberculosis. And for all TB, these DOTS were found was there was in fact lesser compliance because patient has to go there, take the medicines, and many of these patients are daily wage earners, especially the ones who have pulmonary TB and were coming from a lower socio-economic strata. So going to the center, taking tablet in front of the healthcare worker and then coming back, actually although this alternative was thought to improve compliance, it did not do so. So currently they recommend daily regimen for all categories of tuberculosis.
I think there are no questions from other residents. Other residents, please ask questions to Dr. Piyush. He is the expert.
Otherwise, we'll ask them. So maybe one important thing, especially in medicine practice, in contrary to pulmonology practice, is extrapulmonary TB mainly. So, Dr. Deep, any particular things about CNS tuberculosis? Because that is many a times difficult to diagnose. Any resident can answer. There any clinical rules or any particular methodology that we can follow, because it is not always easy to obtain samples, unlike pulmonary TB.
You can ask Dr. Vadia to elaborate on this. I think he is the best person.
Yes,
Dr. Vadia, sir, please tell us and educate us about
I suppose there must be.
tuberculosis.
I suppose there will have to be a history of headache.
It is getting muted.
He was speaking and suddenly went off the screen. Piyush, can you take over?
Now,
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sir, we can.
and examination should be. It is a fundamental requirement. So, history of headache, say 4 or 5 days, fever, neck rigidity, and chronic positive is evidence to start investigating for TB meningitis. Epilepsy would require a scan to make sure there is no tuberculoma in the brain. Heard that? Did you hear that?
Yes, yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay, then I would want to make one other point, which is rather, I thought, very interesting. And that is that we are doing passive investigation for TB. That means we wait for our TB patients to come. Perhaps a good idea would be an active search for tuberculosis. Active
Case
search.
finding.
That means if a patient is, if there's a patient, then perhaps his neighbors, his family members should be actively examined. You should not ask them, are there anybody else affected or nothing. Get an X-ray done, get investigations done, looking actively for patients of TB. And they've seen that if you say 150 patients are looked at, maybe 27 may show active TB. So it's relations, 27 relations will show active TB. So in a family, look actively for the possibility of, similarly, in a patient who is a inmate of a jail, in around him, look for a possibility of TB. And in a diabetic OPD, you check for TB in all patients who come. Get an examination of the chest done for all patients who come. That is a very useful idea to do. And last, of course, that in a hospital, the residents should be checked off and on for the possibility of TB. You might find one or two, and that would be something important. So family members, slum dwellers, patients in prison, patients in poor communities, people in poor communities, and residents of students. So you are looking for cases, not waiting for them to come to you for an examination. Active case finding, ACF, is the way to go for diagnosis. Did you hear me?
Yes, yes, we heard you, sir.
Right. What do you think of that?
For hepatitis B, we have a very active case finding program. So we check for the contacts. About tuberculosis, I think Piyush can tell what is the current screening strategy.
So currently, of course, what sir told is very important, that we should actively search for. But under RNTCP, at least they are not actively searching for it. They are still focusing on early diagnosis. But that's a good strategy, that all the patients'
very
contacts
important,
and
yeah.
these things should be traced, and even healthcare worker, like sir rightly mentioned. And on the other side, every TB patient should be screened for diabetes and HIV.
But now
as a rule.
suppose you see a patient in your clinic with pulmonary tuberculosis. How do you go about? Do you screen the family routinely? Do all pulmonologists, infectious disease specialists screen the family for tuberculosis? Because like sir said, it's
Yeah,
very important.
especially in pulmonary TB, it is very important. And even in extra pulmonary, if we dig deeper into the history, then invariably, somewhere in the past, many times, especially in Indian patient, we do have a history of TB in another family member. So there are two sides to it. One is that it could be transmitted from that family member to this person, and later on he had some extrapulmonary manifestation. Or there are even studies on genetic predisposition to TB running in families. So some families genetically can be more predisposed to tuberculosis compared to some others. So at least a bare minimum X-ray, I think, should be done for every contact of that patient, every close contact.
Dr. Agarwal, what about diabetics?
Sorry, yeah. So primarily, when it comes to diabetes, of course, the strict diabetic control is the most important thing that we really should be aiming for. And it works both ways. Because of the infection, the sugars may suddenly jump up. And in those sort of situations, we generally put them on insulin treatment, and that's the way to go. There has been mixed results.
No, that's what I'm not talking. I was asking about active TB.
Screening.
Yeah,
Do you take a
screening
X-ray of every patient of TB, of diabetes?
Yeah, so we had
XHS.
X-ray is mandatory that we do for all patients with diabetes as part of the routine checkup, because obviously, as all of you pointed out, that asymptomatic tuberculosis can be detected in a lot of these patients. Although the percentage-wise it's very small, but yes, it can be seen. And we do take chest X-ray as a routine thing that we when we work up a patient with diabetes, especially patients who've got weight loss, which is out of proportion to the hyperglycemia. So those kind of patients, or unexplained fevers where you can't trace the infection, then these are the ones. But the most common thing that we find is an unexplained weight loss, which is out of proportion to the hyperglycemia.
The important group where we do actually in gastroenterology active screening is people who are on steroids, like inflammatory bowel disease. So as a gastroenterologist, other than gastrointestinal tuberculosis, use of infliximab and biologics and screening for people who are on steroids, these are two places where we actually look for or screen for tuberculosis, development of tuberculosis.
But I'll just ask you, Parimal, because these are sort of very immunocompromised people that you've got. Suppose you have a chest X-ray that is negative, right? It still doesn't rule out an extrapulmonary tuberculosis. So would you still think that you should, before really putting them on infliximab or any of these things, which can suddenly flare up your tuberculosis, would you feel comfortable doing a scan or something like a PET or something for these?
Yeah, there are a lot of doctors actually who do a CT scan, which is really a better screening for it.
A PET or a CT? What would you prefer?
Divided. I personally do a chest X-ray. So far, fortunately, I have never burned my fingers. But there are doctors who have, and from that time onwards, they do a CT scan compulsory. So the opinion is divided on this. Sorry?
No, I'm asking. You continue. You continue. We'll ask Piyush later.
Yeah. So we normally do, see, about this IGRA also, there is a lot of controversy amongst gastroenterologists, whether you should do it before or you should not do it before. We won't go into that. But clinically, actually, from a practical standpoint, I think take-home message should be that we normally do a chest X-ray, we do a tuberculin testing, we do a TB Gold assay, we look for history, and we look for family history of tuberculosis or past history of tuberculosis. So these 5 things we do before starting Remicade or infliximab or whichever biologic you are going to start. And then about doing a chest X-ray versus CT scan, there is a little controversy. It varies from doctor to doctor. I have been somehow sticking on to chest X-ray, and meticulous history taking means you check whether the patient had history in the past, whether anybody in the family he attended to who was having tuberculosis. And that, so far at least, it has worked. I may change my line of actions maybe if I burn my hands. But clinically, that is the take-home message, that these 5 things you should do.
Piyush, what is your take?
So 2-3 things, like a chest X-ray bare minimum is a must. And second important point is in all these relatively immunocompromised populations like diabetes, HIV, people on steroids or other immunosuppressing agents, lower zone pulmonary TB is more common than upper zone compared to immunocompetent patients. So that should be looked for. One. Second, many of these people may not get a febrile response, or they may have very low grade fever. So we should ask about other symptoms like night sweats, or loss of appetite, or as you have told before, that disproportionate weight loss. So many times these symptoms give us a clue that this person could be having TB, and then we can go to more aggressive investigations like a CT scan based on the history of contact and based on these other symptoms.
Any other questions for the panel?
Sir, hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Chandana.
Sir, if the patient has a past history of TB who was treated completely, if we are planning to start biologicals, what are the precautions we have to take? The only IGRA or anything?
So we follow the same thing, and if it is negative and if it is a remote event, we start the patient. Of course, you have to reassess the need for infliximab and these drugs, but we'll assume that it is there and we have to start it. Then we of course start it.
Okay.
Piyush, there's a question for you. Very often in lymphadenitis, tubercular lymphadenitis, let's say, you've completed your 6 months of therapy and you do as a closure another screening ultrasound test, and you find that the ultrasounds are still persistent, patient is completely all right, ESR is fine, CRP is okay, and you still find the persistence of lymph nodes. What would be a next step that you would do? Stop it, screen further, look for activity, or what would be a step forward that you would do if you find that there is a
persistence? So this is a very common problem in lymph node tuberculosis in particular, and at times even in pot spine and CNS TB, that tuberculomas may persist even after 12 months of treatment. So in such cases, if the compliance of the patient is reliable, and if patient has shown clinical improvement as expected in terms of other constitutional symptoms like fever, appetite, weight gain, then we can still discontinue the treatment. Radiologically speaking, we should look for active necrosis, like things like what radiologists mentioned, that loss of fatty hilum, or whether it is a calcified node by that time, because it is not uncommon to have a persistent fibrotic or calcified node after the TB treatment has been already discontinued. So if there is active necrosis, then probably we can go in and take a fresh biopsy. But if there is no active necrosis, then we can say, and the clinical improvement is there, we can safely discontinue treatment.
For instance, what I would suggest is if you're feeling shy to ask questions, there is a chat over here, which is you can put your question in the chat. So if you feel shy to ask questions, you can put it in the chat, and then the person who is conducting, they can answer those questions.
Then there are a couple of questions, I think, here.
Why not do a CT scan in a person looking for lymph nodes? Contrast CT scan. If it is contrast CT scan is positive.
Yes, so mainly for mediastinal and abdominal lymph node TB, the contrast CT definitely helps. If there is post-contrast enhancement, then that may point towards active necrosis.
Okay, there are a couple of questions.
On the lighter side, I'll quote an incident of Dr. Vadiasa's clinics. So this is about feeling shy of asking questions. So I attended so many of his clinics and they were obviously very excellent. But the trick to avoid questions was look straight into Sir's eyes. Because Sir used to always catch people who are looking down and pretending to write something.
So on Zoom, that option is perhaps not there for these guys.
Okay, there are a couple of questions on the chat. Let me ask you guys.
The person who tell the story.
Sorry?
You have to repeat. Parimal, repeat that for Sir.
Did you hear what I said, sir? Hello?
He's
lost probably.
Okay, I'll ask the question that on the chat. So this is from Chandana. What is the maximum dose of pyridoxine we can give if patient continues to have peripheral neuropathy due to INH with regular pyridoxine?
So the usually recommended dose is 15 to 20 milligrams per day for this peripheral neuropathy, because even the reverse is true. Excess of pyridoxine itself can also cause peripheral neuropathy.
Okay.
I mean,
And
recently, I'll quote this example. Just last year, I had one patient who was a renal patient, and she was on a multivitamin from the nephrologist. One Belong or Benadone was given along with AKT, and her family doctor had given another multivitamin. And this lady was having peripheral neuropathy. So initially thought to be INS toxicity, but on reviewing the history, she had very high pyridoxine levels, and it turned out that all three multivitamins together she was almost taking 150 mg of pyridoxine per day. So that's why, I mean, as a physician, it is very important to review the whole list of drugs, including the drugs given by some other specialty person.
okay. This is another question by Dr. Anjana. Any relationship between vitamin D deficiency and incidence of tuberculosis? Should we give vitamin D supplement along with AKT?
Well, there are some articles saying that there is a relationship with vitamin D deficiency and tuberculosis, especially in Indians who go to countries where there is lack of sunlight exposure, and especially some place like Canada. And typically, after a long stay over there, when the person comes back or during that stay, they typically get reactivation of tuberculosis. So it does have some value to like supplement vitamin D in these patients.
May I intervene again?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Go
yes.
ahead.
The incidence of vitamin D in India is something like 70 to 80%. So vitamin D deficiency will be found in 70 to 80% of tuberculosis patients. If you want to give vitamin D, start. And you can give just this calcitrol once a month, and that should be enough. But you can vitamin D deficiency comes in for patients with asthma, comes in patients with thing, and just in the normal population, if you feel you have nothing to do, get a vitamin D test. You will find that you will be deficient.